So we're all set to go.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure, absolutely. Glad to do it.
I am Dr. Shelley Pineo-Jensen,
Yes.
and I am co-coordinator of We Are for America with Dr. J. Brock.
Yes.
And
No,
Dr.
go ahead.
Deborah Brock is
Yes.
an active member.
Yes.
And We Are for America is, we call it WAFA.
Mm-hmm.
And we represent progressive voters in the Fredericksburg area. We're nonpartisan. Members in particular, as you probably know, want to have a town hall.
Mm-hmm.
And we have been attempting to set up a town hall with you and the people in the Fredericksburg
Mhm.
area since January or February probably. And stemming from that work on my
Mhm.
part to try to get a town hall going with you,
Sure.
it led to this opportunity. And so
Yes.
Dr. J. Brock and I are here basically trying to represent the WAFA members,
Sure.
kind of questions that they would want to ask you at a town hall. And
Absolutely.
we have a few questions, and Dr.
Sure.
J. Brock is going to go first.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing this
Okay,
also,
sure.
by the way, for the video. We have
Absolutely.
about 1,400 people.
That'll be great.
that
We'll give
we
it
will
to
be
you so
reporting
that, so that all your members can view it.
Okay, so there are about 5 issues,
Sure.
keep an eye on the clock, that we want to discuss with you.
Sure.
The first is that many people and a growing number of conservative Republicans
Mhm.
have a concern that Donald Trump is unfit for office.
Mhm.
If the 25th Amendment is invoked, you as a House member will have to decide the issue.
Mhm.
What are your views on his fitness to be president based on what you have seen today?
Well, Donald Trump's been elected by the people, and I am here to do my job as a legislator, and I will continue to focus on that job of what I've been elected to do, and I'll continue to do that.
So you have no commitments about what will happen if the amendment is invoked?
That's all supposition, and again, my job is to make sure that I'm here legislating, doing the things that I've been elected to do as a legislator, and that's supposition. It's hard to project what happens out in the future.
Well,
My job is to get here to put forth legislation that reflects what is in the best interest of folks in the district, as well as doing my work on committees, and then as today, we're going to go to the floor and we'll vote on a budget and tax reform going forward. So those are the things that are my constitutional duties. And you can talk about invoking all kinds of different things, and I am going to focus on what's in front of me, and whatever the future holds, I'm glad to react to that.
Okay.
But today, my effort is to make sure that I'm doing my job that I was elected to do.
And just so it's understood, this isn't Britain, this is America, so you were elected, you're an equal member
Yes.
of the team. You're not here to support, as in Britain, the leader of your party. You're here to do the best thing for your state,
Sure.
for your district, and
Sure.
for America.
Sure.
And if that means
Mhm.
supporting the president, you support the president, that means not supporting the president. That's what you were elected to do.
Mhm.
yeah, we can certainly understand the
Sure.
politics involved,
Sure.
and personally, I would find that particular seat to be a hot one with this particular question.
Mhm.
But from our point of view, and I don't think I represent just progressives in Fredericksburg, I think I represent a broad spectrum of a political viewpoint across the country. I do admit to being a Morning Joe addict, and a lot of this is from there.
Mhm.
But when you think about his threatening the independence of the federal prosecutors and the free press and the judiciary, his poor-mouthing some members of the court, his refusal to admit that Russia hacked the election, contradicting every single U.S. intelligence agency, his bizarre tweets, his barely disguised threats of nuclear war, such as the calm before the storm, pardon to Joe Arpaio for his refusing to follow a legitimate court order, corruption in the executive branch, such as all the profligate use of jet travel, equating Nazi sympathizers and white supremacists with good, decent people, possible obstruction of justice in firing James Comey, collusion with Russia, evident from the meeting with one of the Trump children, his son-in-law, and his campaign managers. Russia hacked my opponent, lock her up, really? Nepotism, foreign emoluments, hiding his tax returns, attacking Gold Star parents, and how does his recent fight with this poor pregnant widow, how is that supporting the troops? So you have to think about, from the point of view of many of your constituents, there is a legitimate question about his unfitness to office, And we'll just move on to the next item.
Sure.
We have just had the worst mass shooting in American history. Given your interest in public health,
Sure.
what are your views on how to protect the American people from the next horrific event? And specifically, do you think that we should have common sense regulation, such as banning all assault weapons whose only use is to maim and kill as many people in the shortest possible time?
Well, I'm not in favor of banning the quote-unquote, whatever the definition of assault weapons may be. I do believe that there's an underlying issue here that we need to address, and that is, what is leading to this human behavior where people find themselves perpetrating these horrific acts of violence? That, to me, is the fundamental element. We see it happen around the world. What motivates folks to get into a truck and run into a crowd in France and kill over 80 people? I think the effort is, what's the underlying motivation behind that? What causes that human behavior, rather than the instrument of that violence? There will always be instruments of violence out there if somebody wants to use them, no matter what it may be. The question then becomes is how do we get at the underlying behavior there? What's behind this? I want to learn more about what's behind that act of violence in Las Vegas. What motivated that gunman to do that? And what can we do just out of common sense to be able to address those sorts of issues? It's easy to try to oversimplify it and say, well, let's just go after the means of violence. But remember, we in this nation under the Second Amendment have that individual right to own a firearm. This is an issue, I think, that's even broader than what gets portrayed in the media to say somehow if we put in place additional gun laws. I haven't seen a single analysis that said if we put in place any additional law, any additional regulation, that it would somehow have stopped any of these events. So my issue is, what's the causation? What do we do to actually address what's behind these acts of violence?
I couldn't agree more with that.
Mm-hmm.
But also from my point of view, and I think many would agree with me, that our laws reflect our values as a culture, as a government, as a society. And if for nothing else, and I think there's a lot more than that, if you did have a law in the book saying that there's no use for assault weapons, they may be fun, maybe they can be used in pardon for using the term, a regulated way, maybe at a gun club or something, but and there's a certain use and utility that's very important to society. You have a vehicle, a car, a truck, but I don't know what the utility of having an assault weapon is that can harm so many people. And from my point of view, and I think I speak for most everybody of the 1,200-1,400 people I represent, that there's really no particular utility for having an assault weapon where its only use is to kill and maim as many people.
But Dr. Brock, the issue is what's the definition of an assault weapon? Is it the way the weapon looks? Is it the way it operates? If it's a semi-automatic weapon, there are thousands of different types of semi-automatic weapons out there that are used legitimately for hunting. And those, I think, in the hands of sportsmen have done a lot of wonderful things for them in being able to enjoy the sport, also being able to manage populations of animals in certain areas. So I think there's a utility there that's outside of that. The slippery slope is what's the difference? It sounds great to say an assault weapon or a militarized type of weapon, but then what are the parameters? And then what's the line between something that has a legitimate use, and who determines what the legitimate use is, or what something can be used in a way to harm humans?
Mm-hmm.
And again, the common place is it goes back to the human behavior. So I want to make sure that we get at these acts of violence. I don't think anybody out there, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, feels comfortable with these instances of mass casualty events invoked by individuals, regardless of the method in what happens to our
May I ask
society.
what you're recommending?
One of the things you could do,
Mm-hmm.
though, is take the prohibition off of studying gun violence off of the federal agencies. Then, whatever decisions Congress does make, because we know we have Second Amendment rights, we have
Mhm.
individual rights to
Sure.
war with, but we also know that the Supreme Court has said, just like any other right just like the First Amendment rights, that with overwhelming public need, those rights can be limited. Our right to free speech is limited. Our right to assembly is limited.
Sure.
Right? So what you could do is take off the federal agencies the current prohibition for the federal agencies to gather data or to fund data gathering by the universities. That has no logical basis. That is something coming out of the NRA because they're afraid of the data. Well, Congress shouldn't be afraid of the data. The data may show that no matter what gun regulations there are, there'll still be acts of violence. But the data may show that certain weapons could be limited. You could still have hunters, you could still defend your family, and that 15 minutes takes the police to get there, you could still defend your family. But you'd have data to deal with. And Congress having all the data it needs to make the right decision could never be a bad idea. So the first step you could do is, right now, you prohibit the federal agencies from researching violence done by guns, and you prohibit funding that violence. You know universities are going to follow the funding in what they research. It's a sad state of affairs, but it is. And that funding comes from the federal government. So that's one step you could take. Then you'd have the data. And you could make, the data will not make the decision. Values will make the decision, backed up with what your interpretation of the Constitution. But then your valued decisions, your constitutional decisions, will also have an understanding, a full understanding of the data. Because one thing the federal government does really well is collect data. They are prohibited from collecting data on gun violence. That makes no sense. So that could be the first thing you do. That's not a slippery slope.
And one of the things about a legitimate use of government, especially in a democracy, is we elect folks like yourself to make the kind of decision to figure out what is an accepted assault weapon and what is an unacceptable assault weapon. To categorically say that we can't touch this is an acknowledgement that we're powerless to do anything about it. And again, in terms of our laws reflecting our values, I would disagree. I think that there's not a whole lot of place for an assault weapon whose only intent is to kill people and maim people. And I'm not banning trucks or cars, but I would ban explosive devices. And if it's illegal to be caught with an explosive device, my posit is that it should be illegal to be caught with an assault weapon unless you have a darn good reason to have it. Can we move on? Republicans are proposing tax cuts, not tax reform, that favor the wealthy and increase the deficit. This idea of trickle-down economics, dubbed voodoo economics by George H.W. Bush, has never worked and will never work according to economists both liberal and conservative. What are your views on giving tax cuts mostly to the wealthy, which is what seems to be going on right now, and simultaneously increasing the debt? And why should such an action on increasing the deficit be acceptable now when it was anathema during the Obama administration?
Well, I think there's some underlying elements to what we have to do for this nation's tax code. First of all, it's antiquated. It is inequitable by the broadest of measures. What we want to be able to do is indeed help our small businesses. As you know, our pass-through businesses today pay a full 39% tax rate in what they have as their responsibility. I want to make sure we bring that down because we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. You see what other nations are doing. They're bringing theirs down. Largest corporation in the world, Apple Computer, is worth over $1 trillion. Apple sells 0 of their products through the U.S. They sell all of it through Apple Ireland. The reason they do that is the corporate tax rate in Ireland is 13%. If we're going to compete, if we're going to keep companies here, keep them from inverting, you have to have a competitive tax code. I want to make sure that we have a tax code that favors our working class families. I believe that's what will come out of this. Again, what we've seen initially is just a framework. There haven't been the defining elements of what are in those elements of tax brackets, what the rates will be. All those things are up for discussion. Those are the things that I think that this has to achieve. I think it has to achieve 3 things. Simplify the tax code so that average everyday American can fill it out on a single page.
Great.
Make sure too that it focuses on working class families. I want to make sure that that's where the tax reform and tax cuts go to. It makes sure too that it levels the playing field for our businesses, both the pass-throughs that now pay the full burden versus our large corporations that, listen, they're doing exactly what the tax code directs them to do, and that is, GE, Apple, pay 0.
They pay 0, right.
And so I want to make sure that we actually have a system that makes it more of a realistic tax rate and that makes them competitive with other businesses around the world. So
one thing, I used to teach public policy at VCU for a while.
Sure.
You and I have the same degree.
Yes.
And one thing I used to tell is I'd like to see the federal government considering, now you can't do it all in one session, getting out of using the federal tax code as a way of social manipulation.
Yeah.
My progressive friends will strangle me if I don't say this
Sure,
to everybody.
sure.
But to some extent, the federal government helps you buy your house and helps you have your kids. And you can simplify the tax code if you said, you can also lower the rates.
Sure.
If you said, we want the federal tax code to bring in money to operate the federal government. What you do with your life is frankly none of the federal government's business.
Sure.
And obviously, you're not going to do this next week. And obviously, Congress is going to have to do it.
Sure.
Trump does not have the expertise to rewrite the tax code.
Right.
And, but considering, and these two people won't even go home with me. I'm in favor of limiting how much of your state income tax you can deduct from your federal income tax.
Yeah.
Because if you live in a state and you want excellent state services and you're willing to pay for them, why should Alabama help you?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think Alabama should raise their state income taxes, but that's Alabama's business,
Sure.
right? But also get away from the social manipulation.
Sure.
It would put a lot of CPAs and tax lawyers out of business, so I realize that's gonna be a problem.
Well, but it would let those CPAs do what they are trained to do, and that is to help manage the financial
Right.
business of their clients, and not try to chase around the tax
Exactly,
code. And
exactly.
that's a waste of resources.
And lawyers can find other stuff to do, right?
Exactly,
And so
yeah.
you could say, really, we're gonna reduce your federal tax burden to 20% because we know you're gonna pay it.
Sure.
And it would get, because a lot of those social manipulations, and I am upper middle class, it helps me a lot. But I have poor people helping me buy my home in Kinsale, my
Yes.
home, and
Yeah. Sure.
and that is inherently not right.
That's right.
Yeah, and you could lower the tax rate because the actual tax rate would be the actual taxes paid.
Exactly.
Everybody could do an EZ form and they would see clearly, this is what I have to pay. And none of this, Warren Buffett pays almost nothing. I don't really probably pay, I don't pay as much of my percentage of my income as my son, who just got out of graduate school.
Sure.
Because I get to do all sorts of neat stuff with it and it's legal and my CPAs make sure it's legal.
Sure.
But that's not right.
Yeah.
And so, take away that junk. That's
Sure.
just social, and that's really just social manipulation.
Sure.
And eventually kind of get out of the business of telling us how to live our lives and just say, give me 20% of your income and I'll spend it on this and you can go home.
Yeah, I agree. Simplifying it, I believe that the deduction for state and local taxes does create an imbalance in the system. I was talking the other day with one of our members from Southwest Virginia. He lives in a city where he pays $1.13 per hundred on his real estate tax. The county just down the road pays 38 cents per hundred. And he says, listen, I live there, I understand what's going on. He says, we have more programs, recreational
Right.
programs. When my kid goes to recreation program, they get a t-shirt. He says, I understand that. He says, but with transparency and not being able to deduct that, then we can, all of us, look and say, what am I getting from my state and locality and what I'm paying in the taxes, instead of saying, well, I don't need to worry about it because I get to offset it by what I don't pay
Right.
in federal tax. So it creates more transparency, more accountability with state and local governments and how they debate and decide on tax rates. So I agree. And then the
Exactly.
folks in this one rural county don't essentially subsidize the larger locality that has a
That's
higher
exactly
tax
right.
rate.
And so Alabama and Mississippi are subsidizing Massachusetts and New
Exactly.
York,
Mhm.
and that's not right.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
frankly, it's not right that I can deduct my home mortgage interest because I earn enough money, my home mortgage interest was fairly substantial there
Sure,
for a while.
sure.
And so I got poor single women helping me buy my house, and so you can't go on the floor today and say it, but eventually, I think that's where we need to lead to. Then the tax rates would be lower, but they'd be fair. I'm not saying
We
they
got a
should,
10-minute warning here.
Yeah,
they should still be
yeah,
progressive.
yeah.
Sometime you and I should talk.
As-
I should shut up.
As long as the bulk of the tax cuts, because there will be some,
Mhm.
go to the people who will actually spend the money,
Sure.
and not the wealthiest among us, where there's a big mismatch of wealth and income in this country more than we've had in 100 years, that's okay. I'm a fiscal hawk and fiscal conservative, very much so. I do not want to see the deficit go up by a nickel. And I think that's been the mantra of conservative Republicans in general.
Sure.
I certainly agree with that. I know that Republicans tend to talk about the tax and spend Democrats. I think that the borrow and spend Republicans is worse.
Well, I can tell you, the discussion is gonna be, how do we make sure we pay for as much of this as possible? And then what we wanna make sure too is we encourage economic growth, and if you look at that and you dynamically score what the impact of this will be, I think that you'll see that the impact as far as revenues to the federal government, we've seen with the Kennedy tax cuts as well as both the Reagan tax cuts, we have seen those increases. Now, they don't occur immediately.
And by tax cuts, tax cuts, when taxes go up, like during Reagan and during Clinton, the economy also boomed. So, and I'm not so sure that you're gonna pay for it from what I've been hearing about cutting people on what they can put into their 401k contributions.
Well,
which is a dreadful idea.
Yeah, I know. I don't think that that's going to have any
Good.
legs. I know it's a lot of different ideas are being floated out there, but I don't think that it has any legs. That's one of those things. And remember, as you talk about, the tax code does, in ways, try to direct behavior. Now, we can agree or disagree with that. Behavior for saving takes pressure off of what we know is an upcoming significant crisis for Medicare, Social
Right.
Security. So I'm a believer in that, and if we can encourage that type of behavior, maybe it's not a bad thing. If you look at overall from a tax code, home purchases aren't a bad thing. The money goes directly back in the economy. Charitable giving is not a bad thing. I think in encouraging that type of behavior. So those are three where I think there's a lot of agreement that says, well, maybe we don't use everything in the tax code to incentivize behavior, but maybe some of those, maybe not so bad. So that'll be a debate there. I think that those will be areas that will probably be preserved with this and probably will not go away.
Yeah, the optics are important.
They are.
I hope most of it doesn't go to the wealthy. They won't spend it, and it won't trickle down as far as I'm
Well, I
concerned.
agree. I think the focus on this, and I'm fully behind this, the focus on this needs to be, what are we doing for the working class?
Thank you.
You know, working class, what are we
Exactly.
doing to put more money in their pocket? Because we know that they're pushed right now. There's wage stagnation. I think if you help small businesses who are already pushed, if you give them a little more dollars, I think they either do one or two more things. They look to expand, either hiring more people, or they have a little upward wage mobility now for folks that work within their company. And if some start that, then others will, because there's a competition. We see so many businesses today, Dr. Brock, that have signs in the window that say help wanted, and they can't find people in those jobs. So, you know, we want to make sure too that we are not just addressing the tax code, but we have to address our education system in preparing students for the jobs that are there. There's a mismatch.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I worked for
Mismatch
several
there.
years in
Shelley.
community college.
Yeah.
Make it free.
My question,
Yeah, or at least make sure that high schools, community colleges are saying, here are the jobs, here are the
Yes.
graduates that are there, we're matching the jobs with the graduates' knowledge, skills, and abilities.
Well, I hope you're
Yes.
talking about vocational education.
Yes, I am, career
All
tech
right,
education.
my question for you today is,
Yes.
are you for or against fracking?
I have big issues with fracking in the coastal plain, so it's qualified. Coastal plain where you have 3,000 feet of sediment, we have groundwater, we have all these other elements that I think
Let's
it's
talk about
very...
the Taylorsville Basin then.
The Taylorsville Basin is coastal plain. I don't think that it's appropriate to frack in coastal plain.
I'm so happy that I came here today to get on tape,
Yeah.
you saying that you oppose fracking in the Taylorsville Basin,
Mhm.
because that's a matter very near and dear to the hearts of people who live in Fredericksburg and
I have deep concerns about that. I have yet to see, and again, my background is in environmental health, and I dug more than my share of holes throughout the northern neck and middle peninsula, looking at soils, understanding the soils and geology of the area.
Right.
I think that the risk that occurs with fracking, and there is some risk, is much harder to manage in sediments than it is in rock layers. And we all know that our bedrock doesn't start until 3,000 feet in the coastal plain. I believe that there are lots of other opportunities out there for energy development outside of our area of the coastal plain, and I have significant issues with fracking there in the coastal plain. And as I said, looking at it, I've tried to evaluate all the different aspects of it. I think it is extraordinarily difficult to manage the risks associated with that. And again, this is our drinking water. So if you have a mistake there, whether it's in shallow or deep water aquifers, we've already seen the Potomac Aquifer, there are issues with groundwater withdrawals, with also contamination in recharge areas. And remember, by the time a drop of that water goes in at the Piedmont coastal plain interface, and it travels through that sediment and gets down to the northern neck or gets down to Matthews County. When it gets down to Matthews County, that drop of rainwater that went in up on the other side of Charlottesville is now over 10,000 years old.
Oh, my goodness.
Exactly.
So whatever you do today takes years and years and
10,000
years.
years is really
to-
the
to-
operative
to
number when we're
mitigate.
talking about
Yeah,
a number of issues also have to
Yeah.
do with, obviously, the melting of the polar ice. 10,000 years to the geological cycle to come back around. So, Dr. Brock, I'm gonna just go ahead and let you ask.
We got about 2 minutes left.
Sure.
I think my group would
Yes.
be, would consider me remiss if I didn't bring up my favorite subject,
Sure.
which is health insurance.
yes.
We've talked about it a couple of times before. I know your
Mhm.
views are very set on a free market,
Mhm.
which I maintain has never worked, isn't working, and will never work.
Mhm.
Let me just pitch again for
Sure.
a single-payer system.
Mhm.
I trained in Canada, I'm an American, went to medical school at McGill, ended up teaching there, and
Yes.
ended up as a assistant professor of family medicine at McGill.
Mhm.
So I taught up there, practiced under their single-payer system. I practiced under a system down here. I just came back from the Medical Society of Virginia House of Delegates meeting, where I had a resolution in favor of a single-payer system.
Mhm.
And you may be really surprised at the amount of support, at least from the leadership and from many of the members, for a single-payer system. The least I can say is that people are really hungry for more information. They're not quite ready maybe to commit. Many people are, but some want to have more information.
Sure.
We spend about $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare.
Mhm.
Studies have shown that $500 billion of that is spent, wasted on paperwork, essentially accommodating our multiple payer system. Studies have also shown, if you do the numbers, that $500 billion, if we spent it on healthcare instead of on administrative costs, is enough to cover everybody right now who is uninsured and to give everybody else first dollar coverage. No more $6,000 a year deductibles, no more medical bankruptcies. There are 600,000 plus medical bankruptcies every year, and 65% of those are people who already have health insurance. So, and I've told you before, we have at least 7 conservative values that are embedded deeply in the single-payer system, including it's a lot cheaper to run. What conservative wouldn't like that? It will bend the healthcare cost curve. It will really be really good for business because it levels the playing field. You still have competition. This is not socialized medicine. It's based on our competition-based system, which is so good and excellent we have right now. Everybody contributes, which is an old Heritage Foundation idea, based on personal responsibility. You will actually have less government control. They're hard to believe, but when the president can say we're not going to pay the cost reduction sharing payments and the whole system fails, that's government control. And also, when multiple payers inevitably leave the system, because it's inevitable, when I can convince good folks like yourself that it's financially irresponsible, fiscally irresponsible to continue our current system. It's called creative destruction, and the system becomes much more efficient. And so I entreat you again and other fiscal conservatives to think outside the box and think about having a system that does not leave a single person outside the system. We already spend enough money to cover every single person living in this country. We just don't spend that money wisely, and I hope you take that to heart. And again, I'd love to speak to you further about that. I see we're 5 seconds to 10:30.
Well, listen, let me give a comment on that. As I've told you before, I'm not in favor of single payer, but a place where I do think we have some common ground is we have to gain greater efficiencies in the system. I agree with you, dollars that don't go directly to the patient, we've got to find ways to make sure that those dollars go directly to patient care. That has to happen. I think that there's some ways that can happen, not necessarily through the single payer model, but ways where we can use the system of free markets, individuals, both providers and patients in that entire process.
Understand,
Yeah.
but it hasn't worked, and it will never work.
Well, listen, I would agree it hasn't worked to this point, but what we have is not a free market system by anything but. Government has come in and has placed restrictions on what's happening right now, so it is indeed a product of what's happened through the years of regulation, including where we are today
The free
with
market,
the ACA.
the free market is based on what you can pay for, not the best way to distribute needed health care, especially when we have an abundance of health care in this country. And my goal is to cover everybody, and speaking as a physician, I would want to have another physician have any uncompensated care, including small community hospitals, which go bankrupt and go out of business. And how can you expect any employer to want to move jobs into an area that's underserved with business.
Sure.
Okay, and so the burdensome billing costs are also a major problem. So for physicians, it's getting a lot of traction. Recent polls of physicians show finally a majority of physicians are in favor of a single payer system. And many of the polls that I'm seeing, and for 30 years they've been saying this, the majority of voters are for a single payer system also. And I don't want to take any more of your time.
You know your small business owners are in such a position to benefit
Right.
from this kind of a national administration of healthcare.
And think about
My husband
entrepreneurs.
works for a small business,
Yeah.
and the owner really doesn't think that he can afford to offer healthcare. I know what would make my husband's boss a more effective boss. One of his employees just had a heart attack yesterday, and the guy doesn't have health insurance. I don't know whether the boss is going to step up. He probably will step up and take a little money out of his own pocket. But for that boss, having a nationally administered healthcare system like the single payer system or the Medicare for All system, when you talk about small businesses, you're talking to me. I'm a former small business owner and an employee of small
Sure.
businesses. And I appreciate your comments about adjusting the tax structure to do more to help our small businesses. When you talk about helping transnational corporations, it makes me very nervous. So I hope you'll really strike that balance, because small business owners employ more people.
I agree.
No.
I agree.
And this is where American enterprise really steps up. That's where competition really works.
Sure.
Yeah, if I
Not the
could work-
competition between Apple and some other
Yeah.
powerful transnational
Sure.
corporation.
No, 90% of the new jobs are indeed created by small businesses, so
So-
that's where the focus and predominance of this effort needs to be.
And that's where Democrats and Republicans
Yeah,
meet.
absolutely.
Is in the places of small business. And so when you focus on that, you speak to progressives.
That and working
And
class
so-
families, I think, is a place that everybody here
And our
ought to
And I
be
think
able
a
to
single
agree
payer
with.
system would really help small business, because they have a tough time attracting the best and the brightest, because they frequently can't afford to offer health insurance.
Well, one of the elements too, with free markets is, remember, free markets too create the best use of resources, so they find their way to the most efficient use of resources. Another element too, I think, in our current system that you speak to is the inefficiency that goes in administering the system. I think that there are ways that we can do that to take out some of the administrative elements that are the archaic parts of the system and do things much more efficiently.
Well, fine, we can do that, but
Sure.
I've looked long and hard at this, and again, I've had the opportunity to practice in Canada as well as here.
Sure,
And I've looked for alternate systems, I've begged other people to give me alternate systems.
sure.
Nobody can come up with another idea that covers everybody, does it for the same amount of money we're spending right now.
Sure. Well, one of the things too that we can't forget in this is, and a very important part of what happens in Virginia, and it's part of what I think is a fabric of healthcare, and that is our community health centers do a tremendous amount. They use a sliding scale, so everybody pays some, but it's based on their ability to pay. They're very effective, extraordinarily effective, and we've grown those. In fact, one of the things I did when I was on the Board of Supervisors is we started one of the first ones in the 1st Congressional District in Westmoreland County. It's been extraordinarily effective in getting care to folks. I've gone there to receive care. I think it's a great model. Also in communities where we have folks that fall through the cracks that for whatever reason, don't go through the system to become Medicaid eligible, don't purchase insurance, don't know that community health center exists, is our free health clinics. And we also have church-based care. We have church-based organizations that provide free care. So you can't forget about those. And those need to be part of our system.
Right, but why should somebody who's poor have either a Medicaid system or a free clinic system when they should be entitled to the same kind of health care that you and I get in my office?
But don't chastise the free healthcare
Oh, I'm
system
not.
and somehow
I'm trying to make
think
people-
that it's different than the others. I can tell you the doctors that work there, I know them well. They give of their time, they have their own practices, and they treat those patients there in the free health clinics the same way they do
No
their patients
question.
in regular care.
But it's different. I had my own practice.
Sure,
Those were my patients, those were my toys, I didn't like to share them with anybody else.
Sure.
I took a real responsibility for them, they were like my family practice. And I think you miss some of that. Like the VA, great care, the caring is a little different.
Sure.
So that's all I'm saying. I think everybody should have the same access to the system. Thank you for
Sure.
your time.
Anyway, listen, thanks again.
Really
Ron,
appreciate it.
thanks
This
again,
is
thank
great.
you, thank
Okay.
you, thanks so much.
Thanks for